Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the inaugural Downing Battock Institute Annual Lecture and to the DBI, our newest acronym itself, as a new part of the Cambridge landscape. I'm Debbie Prentice. I'm the Vice Chancellor of the university, and I am delighted to be here. This is just a brilliant new addition to our growing policy landscape. More on that in just a minute, but let me just say that we are delighted to have Lord O'Donnell, former Cabinet Secretary and head of the Civil Service, here today to speak. As you can see from the beautiful slide here on the topic, is government fit for AI, and is AI fit for government? I suspect most people in the audience have answers to those questions. We'll see if they agree with Lord O'Donnell's answers. The DBI joins a growing number of units at the University of Cambridge dedicated to policy engagement and expertise. And here, the headliners are, of course, CSAP, which is now a venerable old organization, Bennett School, the upcoming Rokas School of Government. And the fact that these units are developing and increasing in number and growing in scale, in impact, and in vibrancy in our environment speaks to the need that we have as a university and as a society. Human creativity and ingenuity have brought incredible advances, but also challenges. We need to marry scientific and technological progress with governance that's able to manage it and shape it for good. And in different ways, all of these different units tackle that fundamental need. The DBI is the latest edition, working collaboratively to augment Cambridge's policy offering. The Institute launched here at Downing College, Cambridge in October of 2025, following a brilliant gift by Downing alumnus Humphrey Battcock, who's, I think, here. Are you here somewhere, Humphrey? Oh, there you are. Hello, Humphrey. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for enabling this lecture and this institute and what brings us together tonight. The Institute exists to strengthen bridges between academia and policy. It has already begun hosting policy retreats, bringing together academics, including international experts, practitioners, funders, and key decision makers in government. The DBI has already held 2 policy retreats, one on community cohesion in January and another on violence against women and girls in April. This is the very first annual lecture that we are going to witness tonight. DBI's inaugural director, Dr. David Halpern, a leading behavioral scientist, academic, and policy expert who served under 4 prime ministers and did his PhD at Cambridge, we are very proud to say, is here tonight, and he will now introduce our speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Vice Chancellor. Wonderful to welcome you all today as you gather to our inaugural Downing Battock lecture here at Downing. We have Graham, the Master, with us also. So I'm going to get right to it. As you heard, the point of the Downing Battock is to build stronger bridges between the academic and the policy worlds, which have got pushed quite far apart through various kinds of forces. Couldn't have a better person to speak to this with Lord O'Donnell, and I'll say a bit more about him in a moment. But partly maybe embodying the kind of style of that, we actually got also another colleague, Kieran Martin, who is going to make some introductory remarks. He is now back in the academy, in the other place, in Oxford, to essentially introduce some kind of additional content and to set up the remarks which Gus will follow. I'll introduce Gus in a minute after Kieran. But so Kieran Martin was in civil service. In fact, he served Gus in private office for many years before going on to even grander things, if you can believe that. Including GCHQ, and importantly was the key CEO and originally founder of the National Cybersecurity Centre, which I think you recommended be set up when you were at GCHQ. So it's fantastic to have you here now at Oxford, as I said. So Kieran, if you want to get started, that'd be fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Vice Chancellor. Thank you, David, for mentioning my 2 qualifications. I headed the National Cybersecurity Centre at GCHQ, and I ran Gus's office for 6 years. Thank you also for mentioning my disqualification that I now teach tech policy at Oxford, but I hope you will overlook that. I thought I'd begin with, it's my job to set the scene for Gus's lecture, and I thought I'd begin with the cover, the opening paragraphs of the latest Substack from the AI enthusiast and great public sector reformer, Dominic Cummings, former chief conciliary to Boris Johnson, and a great public service reformer, albeit more in the Robespierre tradition than perhaps the Gladstone, Disraeli, or indeed O'Donnell tradition. And he has a bunch of AI quotes, and he finishes with one from me. Apparently, it says, all AI amounts to is plausible nonsense. Now, I was alerted to this by another former senior civil servant, Jonathan Portes, who asked Google Gemini, did I say this? And it said yes, and it linked to Dominic Cummings' Substack as its proof. And actually, it's a brilliant quote used entirely accurately by the magnificent Meredith Whittaker, who runs the Signal messaging app. Now, why do I tell this story? Not to settle scores with Dominic Cummings. I hope you didn't come here for that. Not to warn you of the danger of LLM confident answers. I think we all know about it. But just as a lesson to me, to be very precise what I say about where I think AI is to set up Gus's address. And I will now introduce an Oxford friend of mine, Professor Mike Wooldridge, who is the chair of AI, former head of Department of Computer Science, a brilliant man, self-described as an AI dinosaur because he's been doing it for so long. But the advantage of that is that he has some perspective. And Mike and I were discussing this, and this statement, viewed against long-term predictions, AI is overperforming in the virtual world, the world of data, numbers, mathematics, and it's actually underperforming in the physical world. Now, if you type that quote into Google Gemini or any LLM or whatever, you won't find it. Because it was said in this coffee shop in Oxford last Thursday. Mike does agree with it. If you email him or ring him up and ask him, he will confirm it and he will use it in a future speech. But I think it's important when we're looking at is AI fit for government and is government fit for AI? That's a really important thing to note. So let's just, for a bit of levity, try and look at some things in terms of the physical aspects of it. So you've probably seen those robotics demonstrations. You may even have seen the robot beating humans in the half marathon recently, although it crashed into the wall at the end. And you get, especially from Chinese and American manufacturers, these wonderful, tightly controlled demonstrations of robotics in the domestic environment. So here's a test of one of them outside a controlled environment. Let's have a look, see how it gets on.
That's a weight, that's a weight. Stop, settle down! So if you can cook me the meal, I'm gonna go on in here and play Fortnite, okay? Yeah.
Right, so we've seen enough of that as it falls over. Now, there's a more serious point here in that for all his eccentric public interventions, it has been foolish to bet against Elon Musk, but I'll only play a few seconds of this, has actually bet quite a lot of his financial and commercial future on this type of thing.
Elon Musk just dropped a wild claim. Tesla's humanoid robot Optimus could soon work as a waiter in real restaurants. Sounds simple, but serving food is actually one of the hardest jobs for any robot.
Now, that's all true, and it goes on to...
Elon Musk...
That's all true, but what he goes on to say in the longer video is that he hopes, because it's nowhere near that at the moment, he hopes that this will eventually cost $20,000. Now, to have one of those serving you food and so forth, and he said, oh, that's cheaper than a car. Well, sure, but a car doesn't need nearly as much maintenance and updates and probably has a longer lifespan than that. And if you go back to the home, even if that robot could cook the omelette, and maybe it will, but as Mike Wooldridge points out, anything to do with the human hand, robotics is still finding very, very hard to do, and very hard to do it at a reasonable price outside a controlled environment. The sort of demand side isn't quite there, and the supply side isn't quite there, so it's provable in theory, but in terms of commoditizing it in an economically efficient way, the physical stuff isn't there yet. Indeed, when I was thinking about this when I was doing the last minute bit of the preparation for this, I thought about my journey here. If you take the long view, I was born in 1974, and if you told somebody in 1974, you asked them to predict it, what did I do? Well, while I was driving here in the 2-hour and a bit journey from Oxford, I had detailed exchanges with lots of people all over the world. I ran a program before I left that did all sorts of clever analytics to help me with future work, and it's done it beautifully. I'll need to check it, but it's done it beautifully. So the virtual stuff was incredible. The physical journey from here to Cambridge would have been recognizable from 1974. 100 roundabouts, a vehicle that I was driving, and so forth, and potholes. We'll come back to potholes. They're an important part of the story. There is, if you take the long view, there is a small school of us who call ourselves the Dude, Where's My Flying Car School of Technology. In other words, for all the magnificence, and this is not just about AI, it's about the whole recent technological revolution going back 30 years. If you take the long view, what we've done virtually is astonishing. What we've done physically in terms of transportation and so forth is actually way under expectations. So let's turn to the virtual world. When Gus talks, he will talk at some point about things like AI and bias in public services, AI and job losses. I'm going to talk very briefly about AI and security because A, because it's what I know, but B, you've probably heard about this Claude Mythos story, and it is the first time that they've really delayed the rollout of AI models, not because of bias, not because they're worried about job losses or economic impact or social injustice. They've done it because of security. Why? Well, basically two things. One is the internet was built without security in mind, and it's full of these vulnerabilities, these bugs, and AI can find them in ways that humans have so far been unable to. But also it's just a really good hacker. It can do hacking that will take somebody 20 hours. It can do it in less than an hour. Now, it's not omnipotent, and also it's an acceleration. So this is something called the zero-day clock. I won't bother explaining the whole terminology. If you don't know what a 0 day is, it doesn't really matter. But it's sort of the time from when you discover a vulnerability, a bug, to when somebody really weaponizes it. And 7 years ago, it was just over 24 months. It's now less than 24 hours already, before Claude Mythos. So if Claude Mythos takes it down to 24 minutes, kind of the collapse has already happened and the sky hasn't fallen in. So it's accelerating things, but things have been accelerating anyway. Moreover, it's not very good at industrial control systems, thankfully, because it struggles with the physical world. It hasn't really been tested against defenses. And I'll introduce a guy on the left. He's called Marcus Hutchins. He's 31 years old, and when he was 22, he saved my career because he stopped the so-called WannaCry bug, which was rampaging through the NHS. And he's saying, look, your local water treatment plant runs on Windows XP, your mobile provider's hardware is older than you are, and the protocols that route internet traffic is secured by everyone just agreeing that hijacking it would be uncool. So why are you freaking out over Mythos when the physical reality of the digital world as it is very open? That's a double-edged sword, because it means Mythos can hack it more effectively. But the benefit is some of these systems are actually quite hard to hack because they're so antiquated. But let's just accept that it's a really good hacker, and let's therefore accept that AI in the virtual world is very, very powerful. So are we ready for it? Well, I'll give you two examples, one from health and one from transport, before I hand over to Gus. So you will have seen, and the Tony Blair Institute, for example, is very big on this, lots of talk that AI will transform healthcare. And there's a great quote from the CEO of the British Academy, Hetan Shah, who, like Marcus Hutchins in that previous slide, talks about, well, it's actually all about the environment in which you implement AI. So he said, look, think of the NHS digital estate. A few years ago, thousands of NHS computers were found to be running on the ancient Windows XP. We found that out because of the cyber attack that Marcus stopped. So what you desperately need is an upgrade of NHS IT infrastructure. And the glorious conclusion, if it takes the hype of AI to give political cover to this kind of important investment in basic IT and data systems, then so be it. I love that quote. It brings me on to a slightly more controversial topic, where I have a controversial view, and I don't expect everybody to agree to it, which is the role of Palantir in the NHS. Now, Palantir have something called a federated data platform. They also have a whole mystique and hype around them relating to their activities in the US. What it actually does in the NHS is sensationalized as a result. but it is a federated data platform. You can argue it's not even AI. What Palantir do is they take loads of really poor quality data sets from all over the place, and they clean them, and they aggregate them, and they present them in a way that makes it really useful for decision takers. If you took the brand Palantir out of that, it would not just be uncontroversial, it would probably be welcome. But because of some of the writings and utterings of their founders in the US, the book by their CEO, Alex Karp, The Technological Republic, which reads to some, not without cause, as what people call techno-fascism. Their utterances may be techno-fascist. Their product, in my view, is actually relatively basic and effective, and it's used in the NHS. It's also used by ICE in the United States, because if you can use it to get better data to treat patients, you can use it to get better data to round up and deport immigrants. So the decision for Britain is whether on those, what many people will see as very serious and very genuine moral grounds, both the techno-fascism of its leaders and its role in ICE, do you pull it from the NHS? But in my view, there is actually no direct risk to British patients from what they're doing, and risk to them from withdrawing it. Again, AI in its environment. And then to conclude, here we have the Prime Minister in January 2025, surrounded by two robots, which God knows what they do, but no doubt it was a carefully controlled experiment, and he's launching the AI Action Plan. And in the course of this, Downing Street are briefing that adopting AI will transform public services and save £45 billion was the figure. And the press looked rather quizzically at this, and I think they got the impression, much like in the past few weeks, that as when he was talking about the national security vetting system, when he was talking about AI, the Prime Minister didn't really quite know what he was talking about. So they started to quiz this, and the Prime Minister started talking about fixing potholes. I told you I'd come back to potholes. And because he didn't quite understand it, there were lots of memes and lots of commentary, basically like this, right? Is this what we're going to have? Now, you know from the stuff in the physical world that that's not how it works. I mean, if you want to make British roads worse, do that. Send the robots out with their tar and their machines. But actually, there's real substance in this. So I'll leave you with an article from the Register, one of the best bits of the tech press. It's actually what Surrey Council's doing. So look at the bottom bit first. Computer vision cameras fitted to dashboards inside highway vehicles will spot and photograph potholes, which will be automatically recorded for repair. Way quicker than a human can do it. It goes on to say later in the article that it can actually spot little cracks that human eyes might not see and prevent potholes. But then it comes back. Look at the top. Now, if only the councils could afford to fill them. AI in its operating environment. So AI is not fit to fix potholes for government, but it's certainly fit to lay the foundations for fixing potholes. And on that note, I will hand over. Thank you very much.
Awesome, thank you. Well, that was the amuse-bouche, I should say, for the session. So let me just briefly introduce Lord Gus O'Donnell, which is, and people always say this, it's an honour to do, but it genuinely is. For many of us, generations actually through the civil service, Gus, often known as God, for obvious reasons, was an inspiration and still is, actually. So Lord Gus O'Donnell was Cabinet Secretary to 3 Prime Ministers, Blair, Brown and Cameron. He was previously also the Perm Sec of the Treasury. For that, he's Press Secretary and a number of roles, actually worked with Major and right back, a number of years, including 4 years in Washington on the international brief. It's relevant today. Gus was also an academic once upon a time, long back. He might speak more of it, but did time at Warwick, at Nuffield, and also in Glasgow. It's quite an unusual thing, actually, for academics to come into senior levels of the civil service, let alone to become Cab Sec. So, Gus, one of the reasons why you are the absolute perfect person, I think, to give the opening and the inaugural lecture of the Downing Battock. So, over to you.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you to Kieran, who, as ever, has kind of prepared the ground for me brilliantly, as he always did when he was working for me. The point that I needed someone to do this is because when I said I was going to talk about AI, my daughter laughed, right? And she said, look, no one under 40 over 40 talking about AI has any credibility, Dad. So I thought, okay, right, I know someone who's over 40 who does have credibility. And Kieran has helped me out and has done some amazing things that you don't know anything about, thanks to him preventing them. So, and the National Cybersecurity Centre, which is totally world class. So yes, David is right that I started life in academia. I'd gone to Warwick to do economics, then to Nuffield to do economics, sort of. I really went to Nuffield to play football, and because in those days Oxford played Cambridge at Wembley, I played a lot of football. I wanted to beat Cambridge at Wembley, which we did, I'm glad to say. And so that's it. I've retired undefeated football at Wembley. That's my big claim to fame. Second claim is I'm undefeated on centre court at tennis as well, but that's also a bit of a con because that was after the championships. And there you go. I'm on the committee, so you get to play there. So yeah, academia, starting off in academia, why did I go into academia in the first place? Well, having done an MPhil at Nuffield College, the only thing that all of the people that taught me said was success in a career was being an academic. Surprised that, you know, academics telling you to be an academic. And I bought that completely and therefore go on and get a job at Glasgow teaching economics. I'm really interested in public policy. Finally, I get that message that we all want from our professors saying I've got tenure. So I go to see him, the wonderful late now Tom Wilson. And he said to me, well, Gus, I said, so, you know, like, great, tenure for life here. What am I going to do, you know? And he said, well, basically, Gus, you should leave. What do you mean, leave? I'm like, he said, you're not going to get a Nobel Prize in economics, you know. Let's just be real. You're interested in all this boring policy stuff, right? You know, applied stuff. That doesn't get you Nobel Prizes. And I said, well, yeah, I am really interested in policy. And I am really interested in hard data. And I was doing a lot of very early econometric work then. And basically, he said, you should just, you know, like you've spent all your life learning and teaching economics, go and do some. So I applied to join the Government Economic Service. And as you all know, anyone that knows about government and all of these things, I was working on, I'd specialized in, one of the things I was doing was developing countries' economies and stuff for them. So I thought, oh, good, they'll put me in the equivalent of what it would have been DFID, now FCDO. Anyway, in the classic case of government, they said, no, none of that. You're going to be in the Treasury because we need someone to do econometrics. And nobody knows anything about that because they all know classics and they don't actually do numbers. I thought it was slightly scary for the Treasury. Turned out to be slightly scarily true as well. So anyway, that was the transition. And I fought my way out of that box of being the sort of technocrat and writing, I remember to this day, a 100-page note on recent developments in hypothesis testing and econometrics for the Treasury, read by me and probably one other person, I think. So yeah, moved on to, and I became an evangelist for economists getting into the policy space and basically invading policy. And I think economists have been incredibly effective at doing that. In fact, I describe them as the kind of Japanese knotweed of policy because they just get in everywhere. Whereas a lot of other scientists have been very pure and have kept their distance. And I've had lots of conversations with chief scientists about how we get scientists more involved in policy. And it's one of those things that's actually quite complicated. So tonight I want to talk about AI because I think this is really important in terms of what's the next stage of public sector reform? How do we make public sector services better? So let me start the whole slides business. First of all, where are we on AI? And this is the Oxford Insights, Government AI Readiness Index. We are first in Europe and globally second. Wow, right? This is brilliant. So we're really good at this stuff. So let's just go back to COVID. Remember here we are, this is the 2019. Who's really good at preparedness? The US number one, we're number two. Really? So I think it would be a very big mistake to be complacent and a very big mistake to be full of hubris about how good we are at AI and how ready we are for it. So now we come on to how do I know how ready we are for AI? So I work with some people called the Global Government Forum, GGF, in which I've done a study for them where I interviewed a lot of heads of cabinet office, heads of civil service around the world, and talked to them about what are the issues. And there was a lot to do with trust and respect between ministers and civil servants, and learned a lot from some civil services that get this right, like the Singaporeans, who are really good. And also, there was a lot that they wanted me to explore on AI. So I thought, okay, well, I'll explore it first in the UK. So I went and talked to 12 permanent secretaries in the UK about what they thought were the issues relating to adoption of AI in the UK government and what they thought the opportunities and risks were. So the first thing to note is that I did this in the summer of 2025, between May and July. Wrote the report up. Let's see what's happened to those perm secs. Okay, this is Traitors style. Any of you have watched The Traitors? You'll notice that of those 12, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 are no longer in the civil service. Actually, Peter's leaving in the summer, which is pretty dramatic, okay? That's not a great place to be. But let's just go one step further. Let's taking out, those are the ones that remain, and let's go one step further than that. Those are the ones that are still in the same job. 3 of them, right? That's James Bowler down the bottom, Treasury, Susan Acton-Hood up there, Education, and JP Marks, who is HMRC, which again is a kind of non-ministerial department. So that's one of the first things to note about the Treasury. We're going through a period of instability at the top, and this is coupled with what we've seen over the last decade or more, a lot of instability at the ministerial level. Even in my day, I remember having to deal with a situation where, let's take a subject that's kind of important that you understand the long term, pensions. So in 5 years, I had 9 ministers of pensions. I mean, and they all come in with their understanding and ideas about what really needs to change about pensions. And I'm like, woo, actually, long-term plans, we need to think incredibly carefully before we jump in. So, as Kieran was saying, the context is really important. So you need some stability. When David Cameron and I had our access talks, and this is the talks we have when he is leader of the opposition and we're running into an election, he's saying to me, I'm asking him what he wants of me to prepare so that they're ready to roll quickly, something that seems to have gone slightly wrong in the last access talks. He gave me his views about setting up a behavioural insights team, which David Halpern very kindly did, things like that. And then he said to me, well, what could I deliver for you? And I said, the one thing that I would really like is stability of ministers. Can you kindly leave them in post for a long time? Now, there's this myth that civil servants love it when the ministers move around because they get a new person who doesn't know anything about it. Total opposite of the truth. You need someone that actually understands and gets to know the subject, because curiously enough, it's one of those rare jobs where people forget that, 1997, Tony Blair coming into government, it's not, there's virtually nobody who's ever had a ministerial job. Tony Blair becomes Prime Minister having not been a junior minister. There isn't a kind of, pathway to this. They just, boom, they're in. So it's really difficult to manage those things. So that was talking to those perm secs. And what did they tell me? Well, first of all, the problem isn't AI, right? The number one problem was data, getting really good data and the digital infrastructure to go with that. So virtually every department has got legacy systems. I've worked with, as I mentioned, I've worked with TD, Toronto Dominion Bank, and it's true that all bank systems were set up by product, not by customer. So if you try and get a view of the customer, they can tell you, the mortgage people can tell you everything about mortgages, but they can't tell you if that customer's got lots of other things. Now, that's changed and is changing very rapidly, but it's kind of one of those things where, if you think about government, we are set up department by department. The hardest thing to do in government, and this is true, I heard this from all of the CABSEX around the world is anything which crosses departmental boundaries, right? It's a bit, I think there's a great analogy I should use here, which is what I found incredibly hard while I was an academic, is talking to anyone outside the economics department, right? They all have their blinkers on, and basically nearly all of the advances, in my view, come from multidisciplinary activity. And trying to get people to cut across, which is why when I had a group of students I was talking to this afternoon here, I asked how many were economists, and very, very few. I think the economists think that they're doing, what I'm doing has nothing to do with them. It's like, So that really worries me more than anything. It's like, please can we start breaking down these barriers breaking down the barriers between departments is very hard. Breaking down the barriers between faculties I found very hard in the academic sense. So let's move on. So they were basically saying, those prior conditions are very important. Trying to get training programs through so everybody understood. And training for me should be with ministers as well. Right? We often forget this when we talk about training. Like, how can you expect ministers, who are the ultimate decision makers, to understand the risks and opportunities if they don't know anything about it? And of course, in their home life, they've got, ChatGPT. They're probably using that for their constituency speeches, political. They may well, put it into Claude or whatever. But do they really get what's important and what's not? And in fact, in many ways, we make that more difficult because we tell the ministers to keep stuff out of some of these things because they can inadvertently put stuff in there that they put onto the internet. And, because they haven't had any training, that can be a real problem. So I'd love there to be more training. I'd love there to be more cooperation between public and private sectors, because a lot of the solutions here, there are lots of people in the private sector you need to work with. I've done that, and I work with, just a declaration of interest, I'm on the board of a company called Brookfield, which is a large Canadian company. We're doing enormous amounts on AI. And if anyone wants to talk about the kind of bigger picture, where AI goes in terms of data centers, in terms of renewable power, in terms of, how do we manage this world where the demand for energy is going to rise dramatically, and the demand for AI is going to rise dramatically. How do we cope with that in terms of our other infrastructure needs, and what kind of solutions make sense? I won't have time to do much of that, but certainly Brookfield is onto that, and we're doing a lot of it. In fact, it's a 100 billion program with NVIDIA and the Kuwaiti Investment Authority. And we've got one of our infrastructure funds is a 10 billion fund. So there's a huge amount of money pouring into this stuff. Now, how do we get AI to do what really matters in government, which is essentially picking up what Kieran said. This is not about physical things, it's about the virtual world. So if we are delivering services to you, the public, how do we make them better? Estonia is generally regarded as a digital leader in the world. And I've talked to the guys in Estonia that set this up. And it's basically built around a digital ID, which is trusted by the public and allows them to share that data. One of the things I said was one of the biggest problems. And, that allows them, Estonia had a data leak. And because of the trust they built up with their public, they were able to get through it quite happily, and it hasn't disturbed the program much at all. So that shows you how advanced they are. And there's lots of other countries I could show that digital IDs are way ahead of the UK. And yet we start by saying, we're going to have a digital ID, and we're going to use it to stop illegal migrants working in the UK. Which that one statement reduced the kind of people who were in polling saying that they were in favour of digital ID, reduced it quite dramatically, right? If we'd said digital ID is about improving the delivery of public services for you, making your life easier so you don't have to repeat your name and address and have your NHS number or this number or UTC number or the rest of it, then that is how you sell digital ID, not by some negative thing. Anyway, Estonia's cracked it. God bless them. What are the things that AI does well, and what are the things that we should be nervous about from incorporating it? So this came home to me very much. I was doing with Kieran, we were recently doing a crisis management course. I had quite a lot of crises, And one of them was the global financial crisis, right? And you think about how well did the banks cope with global financial crisis? Obviously, answer, not well at all. Why was it in a weekend that I had to spend my time, actually I was in number 10 at this point, but working closely with the Treasury. We called in the governors, the chairs of all the banks in the UK to say, will you be able to open on Monday? You know, have you got enough capital if there's a run and all the rest of it? To which the answer from the chairman was, God bless them, don't know. God forbid, you know. So we told them to go away and come back with the answer. So we had a meeting later, and the answer was no. And so that's why the government ended up having a stake in so many of the banks, because we needed to basically bail them out. Now, the banks were building their capital requirements on their models. So the Bank of England, God bless them, doing lots of stress testing models. And when I was talking to Andy Haldane, who was chief economist, about this, so I said, so how come your stress test models didn't pick up? They were short of capital. He said, well, our stress test models are based on, you know, regressions that are used of past. So the past essentially does this, right? You know, it moves around a little bit, but not very much. So I asked him, so, okay, the movements in the stock market that we observed during that global financial crisis, how frequently would they have occurred according to your models? And he said, basically, the movements we've seen, our model tells us would happen once in the lifetime of a universe. That being their universe, right? And in fact, we had that twice in a week. So this essentially is one of the biggest problems with AI, that they can basically, they are trained on the past. They're also trained, as Kieran will know, on stuff that's available on the internet. So if you're asking them about stuff, let's say scrap material or whatever, that isn't anywhere near it, they will have no clue. If you ask them about things they've never observed in the past, probably no clue, right? So just be incredibly careful about things when you're starting to think about something new. So if we start to think about some new kind of pandemic or whatever, would they really be useful in that? So that's just a cautionary tale, really. So the government are trying to cope with AI, and they've got an incubator for artificial intelligence, which is brilliant. And David and I went to see them a few days ago to talk about what they were doing. There's a thing on planning, which they've, I think, has now become public. And there are various innovations. I think, I won't go through them in detail, but the thing that was quite clear was they were all part of a system. So if you take the planning system, they were about how to help local authorities do one little bit of mapping. Now, I have recently had problems with the planning system through my membership of the committee at Wimbledon, which some may know about. We're trying to convert a private golf club into some grass tennis courts. The planning system is being brilliant at stopping it, and it has enormous numbers of layers to it. For example, judicial review at virtually every turn, massive increase in judicial review. So if you're trying to improve the planning system, believe me, the thing that the AI guys are working on is really good, but really small, right? So you do need a kind of concept of what the system is, what problem you're trying to achieve, and then there are lots of things that can help, and AI can do that, but it's, if you understand the whole system, you'll understand precisely what's the most important bits, and where, quite often they were talking about technical things where they could absolutely solve something, but you just move the bottleneck back a stage. And that was kind of a problem that they were dealing with. The other thing was the caution of ministers and senior civil servants about taking risks with any of this. And there's a very risk-averse culture to which, you know, David and I have tried very hard to get into a stage where can we create environments where we can, you know, sensibly, carefully evaluate and test things, you know, sandboxes, those sorts of things, which is difficult. You know, there are, and this is where, if you think about where people say, oh, AI, God, that makes massive mistakes. If you remember during COVID, can't do exams, so we'll get an algorithm to sort out what they would have got. And net result of the algorithm was lots and lots of people had to resign. Eventually, Secretary of State, Sally Collier steps down, the Permanent Secretary, Jonathan Slater, goes as a result of this. Now, in a sense, you're kind of, you need to be very careful about what kind of question you're putting to it and what its capacity is, and not just, can it come up with the right answers, but what's the public acceptability going to be of these answers? So I think that was a big wake-up call in terms of trying to apply these things without really knowing what you're doing. Other countries, I mean, if you go back to Australia, completely focused on robo-debt, which, if you don't know about it, ended up with a prime minister going, right, basically a system whereby you're using various algorithms to work out whether people have paid enough tax. You end up taking lots of people to court who shouldn't be there, and a total crisis. If you think Post Office Horizon in the UK, robo-debt in Australia. The Dutch had another scandal. I won't go into the detail about all of these. They all share one thing. There's actually not much AI about it. These are mostly algorithms. They're not, but they've been associated with AI quite a lot. And what it tells you for AI is the point that I think Kieran was hammering home again and again. Context matters. Get the environment right, and then you can apply AI in a sensible way. If the environment's wrong, it will end up putting you in the wrong place. So you need to get the basics right. So what does that mean, getting the basics right? To me, the basics are a fundamental point that I think this government really struggles with, and most governments struggle with, to be honest, is like, what should be a success measure of whether the AI thing is improving or not? And to me, it's like, does it increase the well-being of the population? That would be a straightforward question. So if we can use AI to give you a better service when you phone up HMRC and you've got an agentic thing rather than not being answered at all, that would be good. So basically, when I talk to David Cameron about this, it's like, we are so obsessed about economic growth. And believe me, as a Treasury person, you love the idea of growth because growth gives you more revenue, but it's got to be the right kind of growth, which is why I was kind of critical of the mission thing, which said we're going to have the fastest GDP growth in the G7. GDP growth is it's a weird thing. GDP measures activity, not success. Simon Kuznets, who invented it in the 1930s, and proper economists will know all of this, said this is an activity measure. Do not use it as a measure of success. The example I always give audiences, which they kind of get, is like, if you were all to leave your day jobs, let me say, imagine you all work for charities for nothing, and you're all doing great work. Imagine that you now stop doing that, and you start selling crack cocaine or going into prostitution, right? GDP would rise dramatically, right? Because your volunteering doesn't count anywhere, but they now measure in GDP illegal drugs and prostitution. So that pushes it up. So basically, it's measuring activity, a different thing. If we want to measure success, we need to talk to some philosophers. Like, what constitutes success? What constitutes a good society? Well, actually, I'd say it's a society where people themselves perceive that their lives are more satisfying, more worthwhile. So we managed to persuade David Cameron of this, David Halpern and I, and we do measure the ONS4. We ask people about life satisfaction, about worthwhile, and about happiness and anxiety. So we do have measures which allowed us during COVID to get brilliant data about what was happening to things like what was the consequence of COVID on how people felt about their lives. We've got measures which I kept seeing on the press about how many cases there were. We've got measures on excess deaths and all that bit. Great, but understanding its impact and its long-term impact, because boy did we hurt the well-being of a lot of kids with the way we shut schools. I mean, now, the analysis that they were having inside in government really couldn't cope with any of this because they didn't have this framing. They didn't understand that what was really important. Their understanding was very much driven by the medical side, the epidemiological, about deaths, and the politicians who were like, that's something I can really explain to people. So, and of course the education stuff was very long-winded. It was going to happen a lot later. So that, I think, if you start off with that as what really matters, then how does this relate to AI? Well, this is Mustafa Suleyman. I had to have him because this is called Into the Deep. And for those of you who didn't notice, Deep Minds, that's kind of, Mustafa's kind of, I talked to him some time back, and he really made me realize that we need to think about what this is all about. So for him, it's all about what helps support and grow human roles, not take them away. So are those building AI optimizing AI for humanity, and who gets to judge? Really important questions, right? So basically, when you think about this, when everyone in government is thinking about this, this is where their mind should be. You know, I tried to persuade some members of the current government, like about, you know, how do we solve that problem, which I think they've had from day one, and even before day one, which was like, what are you for, right? If you think about the preparations for government, you know, that suddenly, you know, you're going to have Labour come in, big majority, you know, what are you for? And so they had a slogan which was fix the foundations, right? Not a bad slogan, you know, gets you back to, you know, very, very bad inheritance. You know, the fiscal position is terrible. But actually, you know, sorry, this is the press secretary of me talking now, doesn't really get you very far. You need to move on from it quite quickly. So if you're fixing the foundations, what are you doing it for? Answer, building better lives. Now, that's kind of clearly, it's very simple. It's a pretty snappy slogan in my view. And then you go on to, well, what does better lives mean? And you break it down into all the things which should have been their missions. And you could have had a whole structure which had a coherent framework to it. We never got beyond fixing the foundations, unfortunately. And if anyone from government thinks there is a slogan that they're using, it's kind of lost on me. And I don't think anyone else has got there. So this, to me, is like how you get the whole thing to work coherently with a coherent message at the top. And then when you start building this down, so what does this mean for the way in which we use AI? Well, then you get some really interesting things about, so what is going to increase the well-being of the public? Well, yeah, getting better public services. You know, when you phone up, when you interact online and it says, yes, you can get this credit, wouldn't it be great if, like Amazon does, it says, actually someone that's getting this credit actually probably needs these other government services as well. Let me put you in touch with those. You know, pretty simple, straightforward stuff. Not particularly AI, but if you had a proper data sharing with a good AI tool in there, you could get there. So there's a lot we could do which would improve well-being. That, to me, is the things we should be doing. Now, what are the costs of this? And this is where I am working on. This is the research done by David Halpern and Nick Kostick. You can't see all of this, it's too much. So I said to David, this is exactly the sort of slide you shouldn't use. So here's the real version, which is along the left-hand side, life satisfaction, AI exposure. There are things, let's look at number 4. I won't go through them all. Automatable bureaucracy, call center operators, bookkeepers, recording clerks. This is the most obvious area where you are going to get job reductions, right? Because this is the thing, and the work I'm doing in the private sector, virtually every private sector use of AI at the moment that I've come across is about increasing efficiency. It's about not, I mean, really annoyingly, it's about not using it to its full extent. It's about, actually, I can use this to save me money. And the reason for that is they need to have a business case, an investment. And the simplest case for investment is like Brookfield are using it. They've got an AI thing which does leases. They own properties all around the world, and they're paying lawyers to rewrite the lease contracts and all the rest of it. AI's done it, a fraction of the cost, boom. Simple business case, you get it through, fine. If you start talking about the more creative uses of AI and all the rest of it, then it gets more complicated and it's less easy to prove the business case. So I think we should think about AI exposure. There are all sorts of areas there. I think the big lesson for me on AI exposure is that there are going to be winners and losers from the application of AI, right? It's a bit like if we suddenly went into a world where we have free trade, completely free trade. You imagine that. Now, that could be, the economist in me says that's a brilliant step forward because, you know, comparative advantage, we'll all do better, get rid of all of these tariffs. But there will be very big gainers and losers. And the issue which economists will be taught on, you know, Economics 101 about Paretian gains is you must have a system whereby some of those gains are used to compensate the losers. And this is the big issue for AI. There will be lots of losers. There will be people who lose their jobs. We need to use some of the big productivity gains that will result from AI in order to help those people retrain to think about areas where they can get into any of those other things, plumbers, farming, hairdressing. There'll be all sorts of other areas where personal services become important. Number of personal trainers dramatically increasing. Lots of areas will grow. You know, this brings me back to, and the thing I'll finish on, since I'm here in Cambridge, I thought, got to think of a Cambridge economist. Well, John Maynard Keynes, you know, like, so good old John Maynard Keynes made a classic sort of economist error in that he predicted that we would now be working 15-hour weeks, right? And he thought that the growth of technology and all the rest of it would mean that jobs would go and we'd all be having leisure and putting our feet up, which turned out to be completely wrong. So what can we learn from Keynes? This, to me, is the quote. So the Keynes quote that everyone knows is, in the long run, we're all dead, right? Which is true, but kind of useless. This is what he said that is really important. Economists set themselves too useless a task if in tempestuous seasons they can only tell us that when the storm is long past, the ocean is flat again. Right, what that's saying is AI in the long run may lead to a great new age of productivity, more interesting creative jobs, less nerdy stuff. But actually our job is managing the tempestuous season, managing through the storm, which is the transition where actually a lot of people will be put out of work, a lot of people will have the wrong skills, a lot of people will have spent a lot of time learning to be, for example, auditors in a system where AI is going to wipe the floor with those people who are just graduating as auditors now, but because they're learning skills which will be completely useless. But if they had a new set of skills, which was how to actually assess an AI audit, then it's an incredibly creative thing. So instead of going through a journal where you have a very small sample and trying to find a mistake, the AI system will go through 100% and it will find all the spikes. But the interesting thing is, okay, if you're the person looking at that and you've got the AI output, hang on, how did somebody, what's that spike all about? And how did somebody probably hack that program to be able to do it? So it's kind of like they need to be inside the system. It's a much more creative and interesting job than current auditing jobs, which can be a tad on the tedious side. I say this as a former chair of PwC's Public Interest Board, so I have dealt with auditors a lot and know the issues. So that's what I wanted to leave you with, is Cambridge economist precisely got it right that we need to manage the storm. And we need to ensure that if we're going into the deep, we actually know how to swim and manage the stormy waters. Thank you.
Thank you.
Are we okay? Very good. So I'm going to ask a couple of questions. By the way, I think you can go back to your daughter and say, yeah, you can be over 40 and say something useful on AI. And then we'll have the mics around if people want to jump in as well. But maybe I could just start, a couple of things you juxtaposed as we went along. On the one hand, almost a kind of defense, like the US kind of constitution, the fact that it's all broken up, don't worry, government can't do very much, and that's our protection against it. It's that almost the sludge of government, which we saw from I.AI, is actually such a big barrier that it's slowing things down, and so we have to think about it. On the other hand, you juxtaposed it with what you were saying on the private sector, in Brookfield and so on. 100 billion, you just dropped off like that. Well, I mean, Ottolin's in the room, got some money in from UKRI and so on this, but not 100 billion, right? I mean, it's quite a, yeah, well, that's true. Anyway, so as opposed to, you know, so I guess to what extent should we be optimistic in the long run, or should we be pessimistic? I mean, do you want to just have some sense about that juxtaposition?
Sure, and this allows me... Should be okay? Yeah. This allows me to talk about another economist, Jevons, 1865, so-called Jevons paradox, which is like, he was looking at steam-powered engines and the use of coal in them. And they worked on improving the efficiency of that system such that you didn't need to use so much coal. What happened? Did we reduce the amount of coal? Absolutely not. Because it was more efficient, we did a lot more of it. and there were a lot more steam engines. So basically an increase in efficiency led to an increase in demand for the service, not a reduction. And that's the Jevons paradox. And that's what's happening with AI. It's becoming cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. As a result, people want more and more and more. If you take a data center, right, now, you know, the costs per unit were up there. They're coming down every single time. Brookfield are working with NVIDIA. We've got various ways in which we can reduce the cost again. We can reduce the energy input. There's all sorts of things. But the demand for them is going through the roof. So we are working on a kind of end-to-end solution, because what you need to do is construct the thing. You need to work out how to get planning permission for it, which in some countries is a lot easier than others. Then you need, you know, can you, because Brookfield have massive renewables, we also own nuclear, like Westinghouse, can you provide clean energy? And then can you make sure that what you're doing on inside the data center is up to date, which is why we have partnered with NVIDIA to do it, because the chips that will go in there will be out of date in 5 years' time, and we have a deal with them where we'll update it and update it and update it. So, yeah, the private sector is gearing up to do hugely amounts more, which will reduce the unit costs dramatically, which will allow a lot more to be done. And the demand for it is just massive. And the use cases will go up and up and up. We've barely scratched the surface. The question is, and you're absolutely right, will there be a growing divide between the public and private sector on this? Now, the private sector becoming more and more efficient in this will help the public sector, undoubtedly, in all sorts of indirect ways, because we rely on the private sector to do all sorts of stuff for the public sector. But will public sector be at the cutting edge of any of this? Almost certainly not, because of the innate risk aversion and the fact that we need to be incredibly careful. We're very accountable. So I think, and I don't think this is a bad thing. I think probably we should try and be, you know, fast adopters rather than first there. And I think government, the reason about it's difficult is, like we're talking about AI. If you've got someone really good on AI, they're going to be bid away from government very quickly. And it's very hard to keep the talent that you need, in which case you have to kind of grow some, you have to work with the private sector, and you have to think about trying to keep some brilliant people who've got a massive public sector ethos in them, in the system, who would otherwise be paid huge amounts by the private sector.
So let me just ask one more question and then be ready for yours. But one of the things you stress quite a bit, and of course you've written about publicly recently, is the turnover, and you illustrate it with respect to your report. So we have not only high turnover of politicians, but high turnover of senior civil servants. So on the one hand, we can wish it wasn't the case. I think I saw Lord Wilson clutching his head in recognition of this problem. But if that's the steady state, if that's the new normal, then what are we supposed to do about that with respect to potentially fast-moving technology, long-term investments, and so on?
So number one would be, we must not let it become the new normal. I am absolutely convinced that this is very bad for government. I mean, in general, very bad for the public sector. We've already seen that this recent episode with Ollie Robbins has turned out to be very, very bad for Prime Minister. You know, very bad for Ollie, obviously, but very bad for the Prime Minister. So we do need to change this system. I mentioned Singapore. I mean, it's amazing when you go there and you're in a room, you're not even sure who the ministers and who the civil servants are. They're both paid huge amounts, and they're both in a situation of mutual trust and respect. And that's where we need to get to. And I haven't given up on getting there. And I think we need to rebuild that trust and respect between ministers and civil servants. Because, you know, we understand most civil servants, God, we don't want to be politicians. You know, like, we don't want to be out there up front and forever being the spokesman. You know, we love the idea of somebody else having to do that stuff and stand for election. I mean, these are really, you know, there's an enormous amount of respect in the civil service for people who are prepared to do all of that and get elected. And, you know, that's a really difficult job, one that I certainly wouldn't want to do. So we've got to build that mutual respect, and we've got to work on how do we set up our institutional structure to make that work. And I think, I'm talking to the current Cabinet Secretary, about some ideas that might take that forward, which she may well release quite soon, I hope.
Very good. We should take some questions. Teresa, you got your hand up very fast at the front there. Teresa Marte, please know. I recognise.
Thanks very much. Great lecture. You and Kieran stressed the importance of getting the environment right. And you talked about trust and trust in governments. I want to broaden it to trust in democracy. Think about Honora O'Neill of this parish and her great Wreath lectures on trust and how governments, we trust governments because when they behave in trustworthy ways. There are great things seemingly happening in Taiwan and Japan, the recent new party, Team Mirai, which has been set up by software engineers using AI to engage citizens in bringing together what their ideas are in order to formulate policy that's engaging citizens much more. I wonder if you or Kieran or David could comment on where you see AI's role in trying to shore up, re-establish trust in democracy, because that's about the environment we have to get right.
Just one thing before going on to that, which is you mentioned Honora, a colleague in the Lords, who I love. She made the point about trust that, yeah, there's all these polls about whether we trust government or not, but actually we ask government to do more and more. If everyone thought government was useless, why do we keep asking them to do more and more? We're in a situation where, there's a problem with educational, special needs. Well, the government should do more on this. The government should do more on that. There's almost infinite amounts that people want government to do. If everyone thought government was so ridiculously useless, why would they be saying this? So there is something, not quite right there. Your point was, what can we do about the AI bit? I'll let David start with that one.
Well, one of the use cases actually that I.AI have used is a government consultations, if it's public domain now, to handle the volume, and AI can handle this very, very well. In fact, one of the problems is that AI is being used in order to make submissions to consultations, so their volume is going up at the same time. But the Audrey Tang work, particularly Taiwan, I think has attracted a lot of interest and attention, that you can do very large-scale, very, very detailed consultations directly with citizens and then assimilate it. And they do claim, Audrey does, a massive increase in trust in the government as a result of using these processes. So and it does illustrate a wider point, which is that it's not just, you might say what I.AI has done is a nice sort of automation of an existing system, but Audrey Tang's is actually, it's a change to how democracy works, which goes to the more fundamental.
No, I agree. But the one thing I would be slightly scared about is every citizens engagement. I remember the focus groups, right? And basically it will be like, what answer do you want? I can get you whatever answer you want from a focus group. No, I know, it's different. No, yes, but all I'm saying is you need to be absolutely certain that it is different, that it is objective, and that it's getting at the right answers. But then, of course, what might constitute the right answer might be based on a complete misreading of the world. If you think about, if you ask people, well, let's go back a bit. Should we abolish the death penalty? No, that was absolutely clear. No way. Ask them about the facts on teenage pregnancies. Wildly wrong, right? There's a lot of misconceptions out there. So if you're asking people and you're just going to take the answers all the time, I think there's a lot to be said for thinking about actually in an environment where, again, it comes back to the environment, where people actually understand the objective truth, then maybe this all works. But I'd be nervous about it if it got in the hands of the wrong people.
Right, we'll take a couple of questions. And by the way, for really technical questions, Kieran remaining in the wings there. Joe Montgomery, it was lovely to see you again.
Thanks very much. Gus, thanks for the lecture. Just wondering what you make of the notion of sovereign AI. And, we've heard from Kieran about Palantir and the rest of it. Should we be agnostic about who owns these platforms and tools? And how important is it for government that they look at the boundaries and the borders of all of this?
You want to take a couple? Or no?
What I want to do is say that Kieran and I have discussed this at some length. Kieran can answer that question.
Are you still on? Yeah. You know, what? I'm just going to give you.
God, I feel like a Muppet Show or something. So my answer to that is, I think I try not to get involved in semantic debates, but it's a really good question. It's a very live one. But I do think the word sovereignty is doing more work than it can bear. Even the United States can't build fully sovereign AI. It will have hardware in it that is not sovereign, so you just can't do it. So it's a matter of degree. And there are choices. I think there are two broad points. One, Gus has already mentioned, to what extent do you care about your own, I suppose freedom of maneuver is better, or do you just want to adopt it? And that's a legitimate question. I actually think in this age, and we learned a lot from the pandemic and so forth, you need some resilience. Rishi Sunak, for example, who knows more about AI than any recent prime minister, would say that actually adoption is all that matters. So there's a very legitimate counterpoint. But then I think there is actually more discretion than you might realize, particularly if you get rid of the word sovereign. So I'll finish with an anecdote. Because of the pressure of the US-China relationship, even the fallout from the Snowden revelations, which are 13 years old now, there's still a constituency principally in continental Europe, which says, look, we need more of this. Of course, they singularly fail to do it, all in declaratory ways. But there's a demand signal being sent out. So if you look at Amazon, cloud is a better example of this in AI. If you look at what Amazon, Microsoft Azure, and so forth are doing, they're all offering what they call sovereign cloud. Is it sovereign? Absolutely not. Is it exempt from American law? No. Does it have much more national discretionary choice than an off-the-shelf American model? Absolutely, and it costs more. So the anecdote I was going to leave you with, I did some training for one of the major companies, I won't say which one, and normally I train generalists how to talk to techies. This was the other way around. I was training their techies how to speak to decision makers. And I did 4 scenarios. 3 of them were rubbish. The one that really worked was, I said, I'm going to play the French digital minister, and you're going to persuade me that your cloud is sovereign. And you get into an absolutely fascinating degree of detail and policy choice. Right, you want to do this on your own, fully French, costs this much. Political risk this. You want to do that, etc. There are choices here. They're just not sovereign or not sovereign. That doesn't work.
I think I saw a hand at the back. Oh, what else have we got? Goodness.
If I may, actually, not to punish you again for Kieran's reference to Palantir, I actually have a related but similar question. The government can choose where it allocates its capital, and the choice to allocate contracts to that capital to contracts with companies like Palantir is a very direct. Oh, sorry, I think it's working better now. Is a very direct choice. Should the government be making more concerted efforts to spend money with homegrown AI companies, not necessarily because they are sovereign, but because of the job creation angle and the wider societal benefits that might be seen by giving contracts to UK companies?
Do you want to take a couple and just then you can decide which if you want to ignore any? I'm not saying Palantir. Who else we had? I think I saw a hand at the. You going to grab one at the back? There we are. And then I think Lucia I saw and Liz. Yeah.
Clearly, AI is of great benefit, but it's also propaganda and major out. Where do those decisions get taken?
Good question. There was some propaganda and AI, and I think we'll take at least one more. Lucia, thank you.
Yes, thank you. I would like to come back to the very important point you made about compensation of the losers, so society-wide. I think this is probably a point where most of us agree that to keep the peace and the trust and public acceptance is to indeed do some kind of redistribution of gains. And on the other hand, we know that redistribution of gains hardly ever works. So what is the secret sauce? Is there like some strategies or some regions in this world where it kind of has worked on some strategies of redistribution, thinking of like the Nordic states or some, well, Singapore is also, could potentially also be a very good example.
Right, so you
Where to look for inspiration.
Palantir, regulation, and strategies.
Well, Palantir very much was an example, and Kieran might want to come in on this, on procurement. Do you want to bias procurement towards UK companies? Now, the economist in me says, actually, when you start doing this, it's the infant industry argument, it's all the rest of it. So if they can't get by on their own, you've got a real problem. Where we do seem to have a problem is there comes a point where they don't, we're not very good at taking a startup and scaling up, right? Let's be honest. That's a real problem about I would say, number one, that is a problem with our pension funds. I'm afraid I have to say this is, again, I work for Brookfield, who own Brookfield Asset Management, right? We manage, almost $1 trillion in funds. So, but what we do is we invest it at a much higher rate of return than these pension funds because they're putting it in ridiculously low returning assets. And like, why are they doing this? Good question, right? I mean, partly it's the regulatory structure that we provide them to, but it's also, trustees have a very risk-averse thing. You may have noticed that Brookfield started buying lots of insurance companies. We can do everything they do and get a lot more return on their assets because we can invest it in stuff which has higher rates of return. We're investing in infrastructure, which has longer rates of return. Maybe it's slightly more illiquid, slightly riskier, but we're going to make a lot more money. And I think fundamentally that's the issue, that the people making the investments, a lot of them are just way too risk averse, and there's no feedback structure that gets rid of them, right? And therefore, there isn't a market that kind of says, you shouldn't be doing this. So that seems to me the market failure here. I'd be very worried about biasing procurement rules, although Kieran lived through Huawei and all of that, so he might want to add something at the end. So I think...
You over a drink?
So I think, that would be my answer there. The second question was...
regulation and harms in particular.
Regulation, harms, and misinformation.
Yep.
I mean, the one thing obviously to say here is misinformation doesn't require any AI. There's plenty of misinformation on X without any AI, but AI supercharges it. You're absolutely right in that sense. And of course, if you're in a world where, and what AI is doing, things like Meta that Nick Clegg was telling me about, they have changed the way their algorithms work such that viral stuff goes big time. So you're basically saying to people, be sensationalist. Don't be boring. Don't be grey. It's got to be black or white. If you're black or white, then we'll pick it up and we'll make it viral, and that's where it goes. And of course, the world is grey. There are pros and cons of most things, but you only get heard if you push it as black or white. So there's a lot of misinformation out there, which is why I'm very nervous about suddenly, letting the public kind of just, on the basis of a really bad information set, get more involved in things. And what I want to do is improve the information set. So what we need is a lot more reliable providers of information that people trust. And they're not trusting government at the moment. The one hat I would say is I'm president of the Institute of Fiscal Studies. I think we produce reliable, objective, independent stuff on taxes and public finances, which is actually trusted. We need a lot more bodies that are doing that people actually say, I actually trust this as something which is objective and which is going to give me proper information. At the moment, it's absolutely true that there are people using X and various other things which are putting out stuff which is just ridiculous. I mean, Kieran gave examples, just ridiculously wrong. And AI can pick up. His example picked up something which wasn't true and amplified it. And that is a really dangerous world. Can you solve this by regulation? The one thing I'd say in this area is regulating is really hard. The area is moving so quickly that if you regulate through primary legislation, I'm always, try and solve this, guys, without using primary legislation, because primary legislation is incredibly clunky. And it might not even be very good because it's gone through the layers of the Commons and the Lords and been amended, and it doesn't actually end up doing what you hoped it would do. So finding ways to get regulation which is both flexible enough to deal with AI, not AI now, but AI in 2 years' time, is really hard. You need some principles to do that. and you need it to be flexible. And trying to put principles-based stuff into primary legislation is very hard. The third part was
basically learning from elsewhere faster. I interpret strategies, but
yeah, I'm all for. I think one of the things that David was great at, setting up what works centres and like trying to get information available to ministers. It should be in an internet age really easy to actually look around the world quickly like that and find out, okay, so who solved this problem? Who solved this problem of how do we deal with, how do we tax housing capital gains? Is it sensible to have a principal residence relief or not? Looking at all other countries and seeing what's worked in lots of other places. I think that to me is the answer for how we look at what other countries have done. On AI, I think we're all learning, to be perfectly honest. When I talked about this in Singapore with leaders of civil services from around the world, they're all at different stages. The Nigerians have a version of our red box, which basically looks at all of the parliamentary acts and all the rest of it. Does a neat job of helping ministers understand, and does a lot of the kind of spade work, if you like, for that civil servants were doing. So there's a lot going on in different places, but we are evolving, and as the system is changing, I think it's a process of learning all the time. So I think the main thing is to be very open to what others are doing, to learn quickly from their mistakes, not to repeat them, but to also learn very much from the pluses about what they're doing well.
I know there are more hands up, but there's drinks afterwards if you want to join. The Master may just say a word in a second, but at least let me just say thank you. On a personal level, Gus, you alluded to some of these areas. You made room inside the civil service for work on well-being, on behavioural science, lots of other areas, and you gave permission for it. And also, you brought a model of leadership inside the public service, which was able to simultaneously be geeky, good advice to prime ministers, make analysis cool kind of thing. So that's a pretty amazing thing to have done for many of us. Are you going to say a very quick word just before we go off to drinks? Thank you. So thank you. We'll clap in a second. Well, okay.
Capacity as Master of the College, I just want to say very briefly a few words. It was about 2 years ago that Humphrey Battcock and I started talking about what has become the Downing Battock Institute, and we use the language of the bridge, Downing helping as a bridge between, as you'll see up there, evidence and policy, but also between academia and government and policy makers. And Humphrey, as you know, I am incredibly grateful for your generosity, your continued support for the college, but for your vision in creating the Downing Battock Institute. I'm also very grateful for David Halpin and for the team and their work in driving forward the work of the Institute. But 2 years ago, we said one of the things we wanted as part of the Institute was an annual high-profile lecture, and the inaugural annual lecture has been much more than what we hoped. I'm very grateful both to Kieran for your introduction and scene setting and to Lord O'Donnell for your lecture. Really grateful to both of you. We are in a minute going to go downstairs, directly downstairs, where drinks will be served. But before we go down there, will you please join me in thanking both Kieran and Lord O'Donnell for their lecture.